Have you ever been betrayed? Have you ever been betrayed by a friend, a family member, a loved one, or someone you're close to and someone you thought you could trust? Maybe have you ever been abandoned by someone like that? Someone who's supposed to have your back, someone who's supposed to support you, and yet they leave you, they forsake you, they abandoned you in some way, somehow. Well, that is exactly what Jesus felt and what happened to Jesus. If you remember in the gospel accounts and leading up to his crucifixion, and as we look today in Matthew chapter 26, as we pick up where we left off, in Jesus in Matthew 26, we had seen where he was eating the Passover with his disciples, and he let his disciples know that one of his own disciples, were going to betray him, and they began to wonder who it is, and who's going to do it. Is it I? Is it me? Judas, of course, knowing that it was him, and then Jesus telling Judas as much in verse 25, and then Judas goes out. But excuse me, we had seen where Jesus had, from the Passover, instituted the Lord's Supper, and how he wants us to do that in remembrance of him. And after they had eaten of the Passover, and Jesus had instituted the Lord's Supper, there in Matthew 26, verse 30, they had sung a hymn together, and they went out to the Mount of Olives, which was something Jesus and his disciples did often, or they spent much time together out there. And we'll pick up today in verse 31, when Jesus said to them, to his disciples, "All of you will be made to stumble because of me this very night. For it is written," and so Jesus shares here a prophecy, "that I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." But then Jesus said, "But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee." So a lot going on there. Jesus telling his disciples that they are going to be scattered. They are going to stumble because of Jesus. As the prophecy talks about, the shepherd would, there would be the striking of the shepherd, and the sheep were going to be scattered away. And Jesus is saying that this is going to happen with you. Jesus being the shepherd, Jesus is going to get struck, and the disciples, his sheep, are going to scatter. They're going to flee. But Jesus speaks of his resurrection in verse 32 and says that after he is raised from the dead, he is going to go before them to Galilee. And so there was supposed to be a message of hope there, although the disciples didn't really catch much of that part of the resurrection and the hope that was going to follow. But they really caught on to this bit about Jesus saying that they were all going to forsake him, be scattered because of him. And Peter, verse 33, Peter's one that speaks up and answers and says to Jesus, "Even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble." We can at least appreciate, Peter's thought here. We can appreciate his conviction, his determination here. We've got to give him some credit, his passion, his zeal, his faith in Jesus, and, here for him to make this statement. We can cheat and know what's, coming, what's going to happen with Peter. But at this point in time, Peter is at least ready. He is willing. He says that even if everybody else is made to stumble, I am never going to stumble. I am not going to forsake you. But Jesus does warn Peter in verse 34 and says, "Assuredly I say to you that this night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Very specific. Jesus says, "Peter, you are actually going to forsake me. You are going to deny me. Before this night is up, before the rooster crows, you will actually have denied me 3 times. Peter, of course, verse 35, says, "Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you." But then notice, "So said all the disciples." So Peter was not the only one. making this commitment to Jesus. And it was all of the disciples. All of the disciples were saying, we're not going to forsake you. We're not going to deny you. We're not going to leave you. Even though Jesus is warning them, you're going to be scattered. Even, Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. But, Peter says, no, I'm never going to do that. I would never leave you. I'm never going to deny you. I'm not going to forsake you. And all the disciples, they're confidently saying the same thing. Well, what happens? So here they are having this conversation, and Jesus trying to give them a heads up. The disciples are trying to remain calm and confident and assured of their faithfulness to Jesus. And then, verse 36, Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, a garden there on the Mount of Olives. Jesus comes with them to Gethsemane and says to the disciples, sit here while I go and pray over there. So he wants his disciples to stay put while he is going to go some ways away and spend some time in prayer with the Father. He does, verse 37, take with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, James and John, and he began to be sorrowful. Notice here, Jesus has gone to Gethsemane. He leaves, most of his disciples at a certain distance. He does take 3 of them, Peter, James, and John, with him. And at this point, Jesus, it says, began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Sorrowful and deeply distressed, because Jesus knows what is coming. Jesus knows what is about to happen. He knows all that he's going to go through. He knows all who are going to betray him. He knows what this means. He knows what he's about to endure. And so he says to here Peter, James, and John in verse 38, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death, he says. Stay here and watch with me. This was a very stressful, intense time for Jesus. Again, Jesus knowing what is coming. His betrayal, his arrest, the mocking, the crucifixion, suffering, and dying. Jesus was not looking forward to this by any means. He said that he was sorrowful even to death. And he wants Peter, James, and John to stay with him, to sit with him, to watch with him in the night while he prays. He goes a little further, verse 39. Jesus went a little farther and fell on his face, began praying, saying, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Jesus began to call out to the Father, praying to the Father, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." Jesus was not looking forward, and rightly so. He was not looking forward to what he was about to endure and go through. He's praying to the Father to let this pass from him, either totally or quickly, whatever the case may be. Jesus does not really want to go through this in his human state, his human form. But he knows he needs to. He knows he has to in order for us to be saved. Jesus is doing this by the will of the Father. He's doing this for the will of the Father. He's doing this for us. And so he says, "Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will," he tells the Father. He then, in verse 40, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. So Peter, James, and John, they had fallen asleep. And he says to Peter, "What? Could you not watch with me for 1 hour? Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." The flesh is indeed weak. Even though the spirit is willing, the spirit is determined. The disciples had, stated their willingness, stated their confidence, but now the sorrow, the fear, the sorrow of what's happening, what's going to happen, they're falling asleep. Jesus says, "Why could you not stay up with me for a little while? Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation." And a second time, verse 42, Jesus went and prayed, saying, "Oh, my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done." Again, Jesus prays for this cup to pass, but if he needs to drink it, if he needs to do it, then let the will of God be done. And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. He came and found them asleep. They were still sleeping. They're heavy. They're distraught. They're anxious, as other gospel accounts tell us. So Jesus left them again and went away and prayed a third time, saying the same words to the Father about the cup passing from him. But nevertheless, the Father's will be done. And Jesus came to his disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise and let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." So Jesus here in the garden has Peter, James, and John nearby. Jesus goes further and he prays 3 times. Jesus prays 3 times, earnestly, intensely, praying that if it is the Father's will, to let this cup pass from him. Either totally, not let Jesus have to go through this, or if it can pass quickly, whatever the case may be. Jesus is not looking forward to it. But he relies on the Lord and his will. Your will be done. Then he comes to his disciples, tells them to wake up. He says the betrayer is at hand. He is now being betrayed. In verse 47, then while he was still speaking to them, behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude, with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now his betrayer, Judas, had given them a sign, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one, seize him." So Judas has lined all this up. Judas has planned this. They've come. They're ready to take Jesus. And so Judas comes with a whole crowd of people with swords and clubs. As if they're coming against some great enemy or robber, some criminal. He had given them a sign. How would they know, or just to make sure they know, which one is Jesus, which one they're to take? Judas gave them a sign, the sign of a kiss of fellowship, as they would kiss one another. They would greet one another with a kiss. It was a means of fellowship, a means of love, of brotherhood. And Judas is using this as a sign to betray Jesus. So immediately Judas goes up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Judas acting like everything's okay. Judas acting normal. Judas acting like in a loving, brotherly way towards Jesus. But Jesus answered and said, verse 50, Jesus said to Judas, "Friend, why have you come?" Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and took him. All of a sudden, after, Judas kisses Jesus, greets him, and Jesus is responding to his greeting. "Why have you come?" All of a sudden, this crowd that came with Judas, they begin to lay hands on Jesus. They're grabbing him. They're taking him. They are going to try to bind him and arrest him. But as this is happening, verse 51, suddenly one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword, struck the servant of the high priest, and cut off his ear. And we, in other accounts, find out this is Peter who has done this. Peter, in his zeal and excitement, his determination not to let anything happen to Jesus, he grabs a sword and tries to threaten those who are taking Jesus, and he cuts off a guy's ear and is ready to fight for Jesus. But Jesus said to him, "Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? How then could the scriptures be fulfilled, that it must thus happen, that it must happen this way? Jesus says to Peter, put the sword away. No, we're not fighting. Because Jesus knows that this is the will of the Father. And Jesus even says, don't you know that I could call thousands of angels? This is more like 72,000 angels. We sing the song, he could have called 10,000 angels. He could have called a whole lot more. And really only one angel would have been enough. Jesus could have called thousands of angels, he says. And the Father could have sent them. But as Jesus said, verse 54, if that happened, if Jesus was delivered from this, how then could the scriptures be fulfilled? Jesus was fulfilling the scriptures, fulfilling the will of God. And so in that hour, Jesus said to the multitudes, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? Do you come out as against a robber? I sat daily with you teaching in the temple, and you did not seize me. There were times they did want to arrest Jesus, but they were afraid of the people, which is why they're doing this in secret, not in front of the people, not in a public place. But Jesus says, verse 56, but all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. And Jesus knows this is the fulfilling of God's will, of what God prophesied so long ago, of all that was going to happen to Jesus. And so Jesus is allowing himself to be arrested. Jesus is allowing himself to go through this. Jesus knows what is coming, but he is allowing it because he knows it is the will and plan of the Father. Ultimately, for Jesus to die for us on the cross, to be raised from the dead. But how hard this must have been for Jesus to go through, to allow himself to be arrested for something, he didn't do anything. But he knows that all of this is fulfilling the scriptures. And then notice at the end of verse 56, we are told after Jesus says this, that all the disciples forsook him. All the disciples forsook Jesus and fled away. They've now done exactly what they told Jesus they weren't going to do. They told Jesus they would never forsake him, they would never deny him, they would never leave him, abandon him. But now they just did. All the disciples forsook Jesus and fled away from him. Jesus has now been betrayed by Judas, one of his own. He's now been forsaken by all of the disciples of his own. To think what Jesus must have been thinking and going through at this point in time. Even though he knew it was going to happen, even though he knew it had to happen, it still wasn't easy. Must not have been a good feeling to be betrayed, to be arrested, and all that he's about to go through. But let's remember that Jesus was betrayed so that we could be accepted. Jesus was betrayed so that we could be welcomed into God's family. Jesus was forsaken so that we could be chosen. Everything Jesus is going through that we read here in the Gospels and that we're going to keep reading, all of this Jesus went through for us so that we could be saved. Let's remember what Jesus is going through. Let's remember what Jesus went through in being betrayed and forsaken, especially with it being the first day of the week. Let's remember and give thanks to God for Jesus. And we'll pick up next time and see what happens next now that Jesus has been betrayed. He has been forsaken by those he loved. And now we'll see what comes next for Jesus. Remember Jesus. God bless. Take care.